Hello, my name is Bob Sherrar. I am a physician and epidemiologist who has spent a lifetime working on public health issues. I am the current chair of the section on public health and preventive medicine for the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. I would like to welcome you to this webinar series on climate change and health in Philadelphia. I would also like to thank Dr. Marilyn Howarth and the members of the academic public health programs who put this wonderful series of presentations together. Climate change is one of the most important public health issues facing our worldwide community. This webinar series was put together because the public health community must know and understand the huge impact that climate change will have on human societies throughout the world. And we must work together to lessen its impact. Now, Philadelphia is blessed with a wealth of public health talent. There are 8 schools in the Philadelphia metropolitan area that offer training in public health and hundreds of students working on various public health degrees. The purpose of the section on public health and preventive medicine is to bring this vast public health community together to address issues facing our communities. Any person interested in public health may join the section, where they can network with the public health leaders of our community. You do not have to be a member of the College of Physicians. Student memberships are free. To learn more about the section, go to the college's website and read about the various activities that we sponsor. Now, sit back and relax and learn from these wonderful webinars. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Harriet Okatch, and I am an associate professor of public health with the Jefferson College of Population Health, and that is at Thomas Jefferson University. I am honored to have been tasked with the role of putting together this webinar that's focusing on sustainability in Philadelphia. And the focus of this webinar is really looking at climate change, health, and the design of cities. And in this webinar, there are some competencies that are going to be achieved. And the first set of competencies that will be achieved are the competencies by the Council on Education for Public Health. And this is a national accreditation body for Masters of Public Health programs. And the next set of competencies that we have listed there are from the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. So at the end of this webinar, you would have achieved these various competencies. So now it is my honor to introduce to you our speaker for this webinar, who is Robert Fryer. Robert Fryer is the director, he's a professor, and the co-founder of the Master of Science program in Sustainable Design at Thomas Jefferson University. Before this work, Professor Fryer was practicing as an architect, focusing on residential buildings, hospitality buildings, and educational buildings as well. And now in his role as a professor and co-founder of this program, he's really involved in taking students through their thesis sequence in this particular program. And his current practice focuses on just residential buildings. So I'm delighted to give you an opportunity to listen to Professor Fryer weave in some of his experiences from before academia and now in academia as well to demonstrate how cities actually contribute to climate change and how the design of cities can either exacerbate or mitigate the impacts of climate change. And then finally, Professor Fryer will introduce us to some alternative design approaches that can be used to make sure that cities, to at least make cities more resilient in terms of climate impacts. So with that, enjoy the webinar.
Hello, and welcome to a presentation on climate change, health, and the design of cities. I'm Robert Fryer, the director of and professor in the MS in Sustainable Design program at Thomas Jefferson University. So first, I'd like to start with why this topic is important. Well, cities are made up of spaces that can be beautiful, welcoming, and healthy. And they can be unwelcoming, isolating, and impair well-being. Cities can support community and public engagement, and they can undermine support structures and inequitably distribute resources. Cities can regenerate the ecosystems that have been removed for development and support the services they naturally provide, such as cleaning the air and water, absorbing stormwater, growing food, and providing open space for improved mental and physical performance of their occupants, such as this proposal for FDR Park. And cities can evolve to remove these natural systems and resources and decrease air quality, increase flooding events, and increase energy consumption in buildings. Cities are systems comprised of elements in a complex relationship, such as people, communities, homes, office buildings, hospitals, parks, and all of the infrastructure to serve them. These systems can be designed, developed, and integrated to support community engagement, improve city performance, and occupant well-being. And they can be designed, developed, and lack integration to instead support different values and very different outcomes. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve exactly the results that it gets. And so the major point that I'd like to present to you today is that the environment created by a city is powerful and has a very significant impact on our individual and collective lives. Dr. Claudia Miller became known for perhaps a controversial statement that says architects and designers have a greater ability to improve public health than medical professionals. In fact, the architectural profession itself has a code of ethics and professional conduct statement document, which has at its core that architects must use their professional knowledge and skill to design buildings and spaces that promote the health, safety, and welfare of individuals and the public. And of course, it being made of professionals themselves, they sometimes critique the professional code of ethics and professional conduct and urge for its development. And indeed, in 2018, they added an additional statement to Canon 2 about their obligations to the public to now include environmental equity and justice, where members should promote fairness and safety in providing professional services and make reasonable efforts to advise their clients and employers of their obligations to the environment. But they went further than that. They also added an additional canon, Canon 6, a brand new one about obligations to the environment, where they also present different areas that architects should focus on, such as energy conservation, water use, building materials, ecosystems, and climate change. And this is a very welcomed addition and focus of the new Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. So why this topic is important to public health? It's because of the climate change competencies, of course. And today I will be discussing specifically about the topics of integrating relevant cross-disciplinary expertise, both within and beyond healthcare. And so I'll be discussing, obviously, about the design of cities and how it relates to that topic. I will also be discussing the means by which structural bias social inequities and racism have undermined health in the design of the built environment. And I'll also give you some examples of how we use systems-based thinking and problem solving to address climate adaptation and mitigation. And so the topics that this presentation will address are the impacts of temperature on health, mental health, climate drivers, and the means to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Let's first look at the scope of the building impact. The built environment is responsible for about 42% of annual global carbon emissions. So that 42% broken down here is related to the operation of buildings and the building materials used in both buildings themselves and the infrastructure designed around it. Building operations are responsible for about 27% annually, while the embodied carbon of just 4 building and infrastructure materials, cement, iron, steel, and aluminum, make up the other 15%. And I will be defining and discussing exactly what embodied carbon is later in the presentation. So if we look at emissions, first by region, we can see that China is continuing to increase since the year 2000. The European Union and the United States are both declining, although they are not declining quickly enough to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change. And then if we look at building-related carbon emissions by city in the second figure here, you will see Shanghai as the most carbon-intensive city. And of those in the United States, you'll see we have New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, along with Philadelphia. And part of the reason, an explanation for why New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago are higher are just because they are larger cities with a greater population using buildings. But Philadelphia is listed here, and you can see that by comparison, it is much lower than the other populous US cities. There is also projected rapid growth in development globally. By 2060, the world is expected to add about 2.6 trillion square feet of new floor area. So to give you some perspective, that's the equivalent of an entire New York City to the world every month for 40 years. So this could be very pessimistic look and look forward, especially if we are just thinking about that we are going to keep designing the way that we have been. But I would like to argue that this is also an opportunity for us to choose a different direction and to design differently. And I'll give you some examples of how we could, as a profession, all of the design professions could start to design differently so that this development could take place, but our emissions could actually come down. So there are high impact materials and some carbon smart materials, and the material choices that we make are extremely important because of what's called embodied carbon. The most common types of materials used in cities and buildings are those whose manufacturing processes have very high emissions. So we're talking about the process to extract a material, then to ship it to another facility to manufacture it and produce it, and all of the energy involved in that process, and then to it eventually be shipped to a site and put into use in the construction itself. So all of the energy for materials right before people move in and start using the building, that's all called embodied carbon. And so when we think about the types of materials that we use, it can have a huge difference on the carbon emissions associated with buildings. Specifically, we want to avoid the use of concrete, steel, gypsum board, and carpet. Those are the high impact materials. There are other materials we could use that are low carbon, carbon sequestering materials. such as bamboo. I would also add in here timber, hempcrete, sheep's wool, and straw bale. Now let's go on and look at the scope of the health impact. And we'll look at heat illness, air quality, vector-borne disease, and mental health. Looking at the heat vulnerability in Philadelphia, we see here a map from the city of Philadelphia, which is indicating the heat vulnerability score. And that summarizes the key factors associated with negative health effects of extreme heat events. And so this report toward a climate-ready Philadelphia suggests that the extreme heat events in Philadelphia will increase in duration, frequency, and intensity due to climate change. And the neighborhoods highlighted on this map will feel it worse than the others. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention state that extreme heat events can lead to a wide range of health problems, including heat exhaustion, heat stroke, rashes, and cramps, as well as worsen existing medical conditions. Now, social and demographic characteristics like age and socioeconomic status contribute to a person's sensitivity to extreme heat, and those are reflected in this map. So this map includes the population's sensitivity to the effects of heat, its exposure to hotter environments, and the population's ability to adapt to extreme heat. So the built environment definitely comes in here with a population's ability to adapt to extreme heat, and we'll be discussing some of those adaptable behaviors later on. According to research out of Drexel, heat and infant mortality are also linked in negative health outcomes in Philadelphia. It's predicted that on average, temperatures on the day of an infant died will be higher than temperatures on comparison days. And they also hypothesized that these associations are stronger among infants living in census tracts with higher percentage of residents living below the poverty line with less than a high school diploma and who are Black and African American. So in these areas showing very high and high rates of heat vulnerability. Lastly, these associations are expected to be stronger among infants who had less tree canopy and less vegetation near their homes. And so we can just remind ourselves that indeed heat is increasing. And so these could become greater issues to deal with. In 2025, there are a heat wave pushed temperatures in Philadelphia area to the extreme, tying an all-time record high. The Philadelphia region also sees record temperatures. Report shows that heat illnesses and health risks among indoor service workers is widespread. And so the most recent decade was the warmest on record. And given the rising average temperatures, heat represents an increasingly important factor in the work lives of people in the US and globally. And as a result, we can expect more of this to happen in the future. So this figure 1 shows the percentage of service workers feeling uncomfortably hot or overheated at work in the summer, both indoors and outdoors. Figure 2 looks at those experiencing indoor temperatures over 80 degrees Fahrenheit at work in the summer. And so you can see 7% are always having negative outcomes or experiencing these temperatures, 17% often, 21% sometimes. And when they experience these increased temperatures, these are the common symptoms that they experience. The first is all indoor service workers, and the second bar chart is about indoor service workers who are exposed to 80 degrees Fahrenheit or higher heat. So you can see the symptoms are the same, just those who are exposed to greater heat are experiencing more symptoms. And so as temperatures tend to increase, more and more people will be experiencing these symptoms too. If we look at air quality, the Philadelphia metro area ranks worst, most polluted in the mid-Atlantic. The 35th worst in the US for ozone smog. We do show some improvement for particle pollution, but we still earn a C for daily and F for annual particle pollution. And so if we look closely at the particles of size 2.5, that those concentrations, although we can see in this graph, they have decreased over time, but they have recently increased again because of wildfires. There are some in New Jersey. There are also the ones that really impacted us from Canada, along with vehicular pollution, which is increasing. And so here's just another bar chart showing that indeed air quality decreased in 2023. And this report was from the American Lung Association. If we look at vector-borne disease, two main contributing factors is that there are increased temperatures and increased interaction between people and these vectors. So the temperatures are increasing, which are making it more hospitable for some of these insects and pathogens. And just by nature, by virtue of where people are encountering these, that is increasing as well due to development. So climate change is altering the regions where vectors, such as insects and pathogens, can live and thrive. And the increased development brings humans into more contact with these vectors. Now, an interesting thing is that if we add additional green spaces and green infrastructure like parks and pocket parks, that connectedness of natural areas in a city can actually, and perhaps counterintuitively, decrease vector-borne diseases. And that's because when you increase this connectedness, there's more natural predator-prey relationships that are able to take place. But it's also because the temperatures will go down because we will be decreasing the urban heat island effects that support vector reproduction. In case you don't know what the urban heat island effect is, I will also be discussing that later in this presentation. So let's just take a look. Well, we certainly see that temperatures are increasing, and they have been steadily since 1970. The summer nights are not as cool as they used to be, and the winter days are not as cold as they used to be. So we are just feeling pressure both days and generally overnights as well. And this shows the development patterns in the Philadelphia area since 1930. You can see that we have been exploding in the surrounding environment. And so the development patterns around Philadelphia are increasing the interaction between people and vector-borne diseases. Here is an example of that where the Philadelphia Department of Public Health has identified 3 symptomatic West Nile virus infections in 2025. 2 of them were locally acquired. And if we look at the positivity in WNV, that in 2025, that positivity is higher than the year-to-date historic median rate from 2001 to 2024. And so this map here is showing West Nile virus positive mosquito pool locations. And then this is just some information about ticks, which is also the other pathway of vector-borne disease that is popular or dominant in the area. And just sort of the different disease types and what the main vectors are, the different kinds of ticks and the incubation periods and et cetera, and how to treat them. Mental health is greatly impacted by the built environment. Human beings spend more than 90% of their lives indoors. Yet, according to Evans here, whose research I'm pulling this information from, we know much more about ambient environmental conditions and health than we do about the built environment and health. And there are some environmental characteristics with direct effects on mental health, including housing, crowding, noise, indoor air quality, and light. And the built environment definitely controls mostly those environmental characteristics and how they design buildings and cities and neighborhoods. And the built environment can indirectly impact mental health by altering psychosocial processes with known mental health consequences. And so this table from Evans' research indicates some environmental characteristics and their mental health impacts. So high-rise housing can lead to elevated psychological distress, especially among low-income mothers. Which floor you live on in that high-rise housing has an impact. Adults living on higher floors have more psychological distress. The quality of the housing, like structural defects, hazards, poor maintenance, lead to greater psychological distress in housing of poor quality. The neighborhood quality, whether how connected socially these spaces are, can have greater psychological distress and poor cognitive development in children. And even looking at Alzheimer's facilities, that if you're able to design those with smaller scale units that are more home-like with less noise and accommodate wandering, that those have been shown to have improved functioning. Those patients have been shown to have improved functioning, including less disorientation and fewer behavioral problems. Dr. Ulrich is probably a more well-known researcher for architects and definitely sustainable designers because of some of his research. This one here research shows that modifications can be made to reduce hospital noise, prevent the spread of infectious agents, reduce stress and fatigue, and even more by design rather than modifying staff behavior and organizational culture. What Ulrich really became known for was a study he did in 1984 that compared patients who had undergone surgery, where half of them stayed in a room with a view of a park with deciduous trees, just a nice view out of their windows, while the other half were in a room with a view of a brick wall. And guess what? Those with the view of nature required less analgesia and had reduced length of stay in the hospital. And so this became part of evidence used to support this hypothesis called biophilia. Biophilia was a notion that humans have evolved to recognize spaces and places where their well-being would flourish. You think about how the migration patterns and that we were, over times of evolution, so starting in Africa and then moving out, that humans sort of had this innate ability evolved into them, that they could recognize healthy spaces over unhealthy ones, and that this has an impact on both our mental and physical well-being. And so this study by Ulrich supports that. Now, this idea of biophilia has moved into design, where a lot of design is focused now on trying to connect people to nature to have exactly these sorts of positive outcomes. And so we see an example of this even with Jefferson's own Honickman Center and how it has been designed. Studies have shown that even facsimiles of nature, although not as great as being really in nature, but the facsimiles of them, such as the nature, the blossoms and trees and printed on this wall, they still have a positive outcome. And so these things can be used as part of the design of the built environment. In fact, there is a lot of research that shows some other health outcomes, such as social isolation and loneliness is impacted by design, as is suicide rates, cognitive functioning, perception of safety, and more. The image that you see here is from the Singapore airport, where Singapore is sort of known as the most biophilic city in the world. They have redesigned their entire city based around this notion. And what we're seeing here is an attempt to use biophilia to reduce the stress related to travel. Let's take a closer look now at climate drivers. Climate change really is a global phenomenon that has a local impact, and that's mostly how we experience this global phenomenon of climate change. The largest contributors to this are greenhouse gas emissions and land use change. As I touched on briefly earlier, greenhouse gas emissions lead to climate change, and emissions are still climbing. If we look here at the graph on the right, This is the annual carbon dioxide emissions. It says dioxide, but only shows CO. That is not my error. But annual carbon dioxide emissions worldwide from 1940 to 2024. Clearly, there's an increasing trend, and we are all expecting that to just increase. So just a reminder that of these metric tons of CO2 emissions, 42% of this, almost half, is from the built environment. Land use change. So the image on the right is showing land cover change in the Delaware River Basin, which of course Philadelphia is a part, and we can see the development patterns over time. And what we see is that regionally, forest cover replaced agriculture up until about 1970, appearing now on the screen. You can see that happening. Simultaneously, developed areas replaced agriculture and grasslands through 2020. Now that developed area is made up of low intensity and medium to high intensity. But mostly this development was low intensity, which led to a lot of urban sprawl, mostly for single family homes. And single family homes, being low intensity, require more land use change and have more greenhouse gas emissions compared to high intensity development. So this is a major driver of climate change, part of which is parking lots. And so we have a lot of parking, as many cities do, but ours is about 3.7 times greater than our housing density. Now, the bad news is that most of these are what are called off-street, but on the surface. So these aren't the ones that have multiple levels to parking. These are ones that are just on the surface, and that is it. So they are, it's not an efficient use of space because you're not parking ones above that space, like in a structured parking lot. And they also contribute to some other negative outcomes. These are usually made of asphalt, which store heat and increase local temperatures. But the image on the right is showing the parking stall density. And so, of course, the darker red colors are where it is more intense, meaning that's probably where a lot of the off-street structured parking is happening, which indeed it is. And you can see parking is everywhere. So now let's talk about the urban heat island effect. If you don't know, this is a phenomenon that happens around all cities, not just Philadelphia, and it's because of the materials and the geometry of the buildings. The fact that there are a lot of high-rise buildings makes the situation worse. It increases the urban heat island effect. So what this basically says that the temperatures, if you were to scan the greater Philadelphia area, the temperatures in our suburbs and rural areas are going to be lower than it is in the city. And again, oops, this is because the urban fabric, as we call it, is comprised of heat absorbing materials and waste heat that raise temperatures locally. So materials that we always find in cities, such as concrete, asphalt, brick, and stone, are high thermal mass materials that store heat. Thermal mass materials just mean they have a lot of thermal mass where they can absorb and store heat within them. There's also waste heat from equipment such as HVAC systems, which also contributes to elevated local temperatures. So in Philadelphia, what we find are that compared to the suburban and rural areas, our temperatures are 5 to 12 degrees higher on average, but there are some specific parts of Philadelphia that can be as high as 22 degrees hotter than other neighborhoods. So the urban heat island effect is among the top two issues that Philadelphia faces from climate change. The first probably being flooding, but we'll get to that later. So with land use change and development, we see that the ecosystem services that we tend to take for granted get replaced with parking lots, with buildings, with roads and streets. And so ecosystem services are those things that nature provides to us for free that are systematically removed by land use change. Now, these services are not part of economic models. So the change of land use does not, or the fact that we don't have clean water or less biodiversity does not negatively impact our GDP, right? These are not part of economic models, which is, there's a huge argument that we need to take these into account in our economic models, but every time we do, it would almost immediately bankrupt um, all economies. So this hasn't happened. But things that we take for granted, like clean water, like cooling temperatures, storing carbon, having clean air, just having beautiful places for us to spend time in, all of these things are considered ecosystem services. And the removal of them accelerates climate change by removing the services that regulate heat and air quality. It also negatively impacts physical and mental health and decreases biodiversity required for other natural processes. So you might see around the city the installation of pollinator gardens because for a while we were missing bees needed to basically give us all of the food that we consume. So now I'd like to take a look at some of the design drivers of climate change, such as why are buildings constructed and designed, where building is happening, how buildings are designed, and who they ultimately serve. So why buildings are constructed and designed? Well, it's probably no surprise to you that buildings are expensive to both design and build. And it's probably no surprise to you that this can only happen in our current economic system by generating a profit. So developers undergo this process, but they have to look for opportunities to generate profit. And there has been a lot of economic construction activity over the last year in Center City, where it's seen $1.2 billion in development activity. And what kind of activity was that? Well, it was mostly residential. And it then had mixed use and healthcare and education as the top three. So the large majority of new construction is residential, which is good news, right? It should be because there's a strong need for housing in Philadelphia. So let's look closer at what housing was created. Let's look at housing and household income. We can see that the majority of households make less than $50,000 per year. Actually, Philadelphia has more families and people below the poverty level compared to both Pennsylvania and US. And so those who make less than $50,000 per year are also house burdened, with housing costing the majority of them 50% or more of their income. In fact, you are considered to be house burdened if you spend more than a third or roughly 30% on like mortgage, rent, and all of the utilities for your home. If you're spending more than a third of your income on that, you are considered house burdened. So I've adapted this chart from eConsult Solutions, which is outlining the per each different household income group, what is the housing costs as a share of that income? And so we can see that uh, below this line, you would be considered unaffordable, and above this line, affordable. So we can see that the majority of those are spending this amount of their income on housing related costs. Where if we look at the other two income brackets, we can see they are above the house burden line, and it is affordable for them to live in the homes that they choose to live in. However, there aren't a lot of options for those living with an income below $50,000. And so a lot of that new construction is not geared towards them. It's rather geared towards the profit. So it's most of the new construction is going to market rate residential. And what happens is it tends to squeeze residents out of the market. So neighborhoods that they have been living in probably for quite a while in some cases, the costs are suddenly going up because development is happening in their neighborhood now. And so that kind of spreads around the city. That's a process known as gentrification. And Bruce Mitchell, who is principal researcher with the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, says that between 1980 and 2020, 10 out of 18 gentrifying neighborhoods in Philadelphia shifted from Black majorities to white or other races. Philadelphia is ranked number 6 in terms of the number of majority Black neighborhoods that turned over and became a majority white or other race. And if we look at Kensington, the median home value has gone up from $40,000 in 2000 to $350,000. So it's a huge increase in home value and home cost. In fact, we need to be very careful as we add green infrastructure for other very laudable reasons. That tends to lead to gentrification, as gentrification first surrounds all park sites. And so as we add green infrastructure, we must at the same time have community-led greening projects paired with social housing policies. And so there's a lot of development, but we're lagging behind in Philadelphia with that community-led greening project and social housing policies counterbalance. Which gets us to the question, then who do our buildings ultimately serve? Well, this is a map from 1937, known as the redlining map of Philadelphia from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So this was a bank that would hand out loans for mortgages or property development. And they used this map to identify neighborhoods where investment and lending were discouraged. So if you were in a gold or red neighborhood here, you had a much more difficult time getting a loan, if any ability at all. And this was known as redlining because some of the areas were, outlined in red. The neighborhoods once deemed hazardous or declining by the 1930s redlining maps now, even today, experience the highest rates of poverty, poor health, and homicides, which highlights the enduring impact of racially discriminatory housing policies. So development and housing opportunities serve those who can help the developers and lenders make profit. Now let's just take a look now. We're going to transition to how buildings are designed. Obviously, we are building, buildings can be seen as kind of vessels that serve a particular function. Among those, and probably top among those, is to make sure that we have a sheltered place to do whatever business or living we need to do, and that we are comfortable in those spaces. And so most of the energy consumed in buildings is to provide thermal comfort. Thermal comfort is the architectural and engineering term for do you feel too hot or too cold? And we want to make sure that you feel just right. However, since the advent of air conditioning, combined with the modernist movement in architecture and cheap fossil fuels, buildings have instead been designed to overpower the climate rather than designing with it. Prior to the advent of air conditioning, even in downtown buildings, the orientation of the building was very important. There were a lot of shades covering the windows on the outside of buildings. We made sure that there was a path for air, that all the windows were operable, first of all, and that there was a path of air that could come through and exit out the other side of the building. That's called cross ventilation. And we were making sure that all of that was there. Well, with the advancements in materials and air conditioning and a new design approach that kind of celebrated these advances, what happened over time is that we just decided to overpower the climate. This approach to design is being reevaluated with sustainable design, however. But I do want to just talk to you in a little more depth right now about thermal comfort because it is important. It is the most operations energy is consumed to deliver thermal comfort because it is the foundation to providing healthy, comfortable, and energy efficient buildings. It's a component of health. It's a component of productivity, and it directly dictates how much energy is consumed and therefore how much greenhouse gas emissions are generated, at least as long as we're using fossil fuels. So you may be able to relate to this meme here. It's certainly true in some of the buildings I have experienced across the campus. And it just goes to show you that it's really hard to be productive and to be healthy if you're walking into an office that is, 59 degrees or whatever. So what is thermal comfort? I find this definition to be really interesting. So as defined by ASHRAE, which is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, they have a standard 55 which defines this. Thermal comfort is the condition of mind that expresses satisfaction with the thermal environment and is assessed by subjective evaluation. So why I think this is so interesting is because of the words I've highlighted in red. What is really perceived to be an objective measurement applied by engineers actually comes down to subjectivity. Whether or not we are comfortable is a state of mind, and it's a state of our own mind. And so one person may be very comfortable, and the person sitting next to them may not be. And you may have experienced at this in your home or work. And you may also have noticed that you yourself, as you have gotten older, don't find the same kind of conditions comfortable as you once did. And so the idea that they're at the base of all of this objectivity, perceived objectivity, and global climate change is actually a subjective experience I find to be very interesting. So how does this happen? How does thermal comfort happen? Well, the human body is continually exchanging energy with its environment, and that is experienced subjectively. We, as this image suggests, we tend to do most of our exchange via radiation, or you could say our body prefers to exchange energy with its environment using radiation. And this can help explain why we really love to be close to a fire as it radiates its heat, or why people find heat from radiators in a building to be much more comfortable and preferable to a duct that is blowing hot air. So if this exchange of energy happens too quickly, we feel cold, and if it's not done quickly enough, we tend to feel hot. Now, we do this based on the kind of climate that we are living in. So if we look at the figure on the right, the map of the US, kind of categorized and labeled according to the ASHRAE climate zones. And so if we can think of 4 as being the middle of the different climate zones, that if you have a climate zone 5, 6, 7, or 8, those are ones that experience colder temperatures. They're to the north usually, and they will be dominated by their heating demand. If you're in a climate zone 3, 2, or 1, that tends to be in the southern part of the US, and those are experience hotter temperatures, and so they will have a dominant cooling demand. Their energy consumption will predominantly be used to create cooler spaces. So we're in the middle. We're at number 4. We are actually in 4A. which is known as a mixed humid zone. So we have both periods of the year where we need heat and cooling, and we also have the added benefit of being humid. It's a very hard place to consume less energy, but yet there are ways we can do it. So um, the 4A climate zone means it's mixed. We have both heating and cooling happening, and there are some years where our heating demands, we are still heating dominated because our winters get much colder. Okay, so if we now look specifically at cities, cities are responsible for 75% of all human-produced global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if we look at that 75% to see how much of it is being attributed to buildings, then we get emissions like this. So the highest on this list looks to be Sydney, Australia. The lowest for buildings is Los Angeles. And in Philadelphia, we come in near the bottom of that list at about 60%. And buildings consume nearly half of all the energy produced in the United States. But then if we look only at electricity, we consume nearly 75% of all the electricity in the United States to operate. Now, if we look at our emissions over time, since 2006 and 2022 in Philadelphia, you can see we have gone down, and that is excellent. We are doing a good job with that. So if we think about how we heat and cool our buildings, it's through gas and electricity mostly. In fact, we can see here, um, 37% is gas, 48% is electricity, and then the other subsectors by emissions are there. Natural gas has a higher warming potential, that is greenhouse gas emissions, than electricity. And the use of electricity results in a lower carbon footprint. And that is why you may have heard of a recent drive to electrify our buildings and to change our stoves and ovens from gas to electric. And this is the reason why. Another thing that natural gas has is, in addition to it having higher global warming potential than electricity, it also has an upstream, meaning before we even use it in our building, upstream methane emissions from extraction. And I just added this figure here so you could see what's involved in the different scopes, because this is mentioning the scopes up here. And so scope 1 includes all of these different, like it includes agriculture, it includes industry, but the stationary fuel consumption is where housing happens. And that is also involved in scope 1 and scope 2. So let's take a look at what buildings are being built in and around Philadelphia. Well, the majority of buildings and space in Philadelphia are single family residential, the most spatially and energy inefficient types of building. So we can see the ones in the orange, yellow, and this, I don't know what color you would call that, but these three are related to housing. And we can see it's the same information just presented in a different way. You can just see that the majority of development in and around Philadelphia is for single family homes. And this is just how spatially it is distributed across the city. So not only are we mostly building single family residences, the single family residences have exploded in size over time. In 1950, the average floor area was about 1,000 square feet for a home. In 2000, that has grown to 2,200 square feet. Now, the other interesting thing is that as our houses have increased, the number of people living in them has decreased. So in 1950, 3.37 people per household on average. In 2000, there were 2.62 people per household. Or if we could look at that a different way, in 1950, there was 297 square feet per person. Whereas by 2000, that has exploded to 840 square feet per person. So let's take a look now at the impacts of all of these current drivers, like the urban heat island effect, the increase in number and severity of flooding events, increase in operational embodied carbon, decrease in air quality, and impact on infrastructure. So the urban heat island effect is greatest where there are fewest trees. So this on the left is a map, an urban forest map of Philadelphia, and on the right is the heat exposure index. Um, on the right, the heat exposure index, the very high and high areas are mostly centered in those kinds of neighborhoods that we're now starting to see a pattern around. And on the left, we can see indeed that the tree cover is lowest where the temperatures are highest. And I've tried to highlight, oops, I tried to highlight these as best I could here. So you can see there's a significant, at least this very significant overlap between them. So the Nature Conservancy has created this map showing where trees are needed the most in Philadelphia, kind of per zip code here and exact locations. And temperatures also tend to be highest in historically redlined neighborhoods. And so if we overlay the redlining map on top of this, we can indeed see that there is a significant overlap where temperatures are highest. Let's take a look at the impact of current drivers on flooding. Well, flooding is the most common natural disaster in the United States, and Pennsylvania had the third highest damages from flooding in the US in 2022, and that was really driven by Hurricane Ida, which had this kind of impact on Philadelphia. Philadelphia is located at the lower end of major watersheds, and it's also at the lowest elevation. So we're basically sitting in a bowl that is receiving streams of water from all of these different watersheds. In fact, some densely populated areas have a high risk for flash floods as the construction of buildings, highways, driveways, and parking lots increases runoff, like we're kind of seeing here, by reducing the amount of rain absorbed by the ground. You know the song, they they bulldozed paradise and put up a parking lot instead. Well, what that does is it removes the ability for rain to, and other water sources or whatever, to be absorbed by the earth. And instead it's now, the earth has been basically sealed on top by concrete or asphalt, and the water has to run across that surface. And so that can, at the scales we're talking about across the city, it leads to outcomes like this. There are two communities in Philadelphia that are located in high-risk flood zones that see some of the greatest impacts from this. The first is Eastwick, which going all the way back to the 29, the 30s, 1999 and 2020, and again in 2023, extreme flooding events. Eastwick was a wetland, and it is located at the very bottom of that bowl where all of those streams are running into it, right? All of those watersheds. So it used to be marshland, a wetland, and we've removed the wetland and instead put an entire neighborhood. And so it's no surprise really that Eastwick is flooding. The other neighborhood is Manayunk. And so we've seen over the past 10 years a couple of floods. Again, Hurricane Ida and another one in 2017, which had some really negative outcomes for Manayunk. You can see the trees kind of flooding away. You may have dined outside on this patio, which is now, you have to understand the height of this. Um, it's tens of feet above where the water line usually is. So this flooding also leads to river pollution. And to understand why, we need to look at a little bit of history. Philadelphia's sewer system was originally designed and built in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And since then, the amount of impervious area in the city has drastically increased. But this is the state-of-the-art system at that time, where streams were diverted into pipes. And this was actually a way to protect clean water at that time from contamination before it reached the Schuylkill River, which is where it was the source of our drinking water, and it still is. But at the time, it was the largest infrastructure project ever undertaken. And to make the project more efficient, the pipes carrying streams were engineered to carry wastewater from indoor plumbing as well, which is known as a combined stormwater sewage system. So what that means is that the rain that used to soak into the ground now quickly runs across impervious surfaces and into sewer systems. And when large amounts of precipitation fall over a small area in a short period of time, this can overwhelm the sewer system and pollute the river with raw sewage. And that is because if we look what happens during dry weather, um, sewage runs, you flush the toilet, sewage runs into the system. And during normal times, it then kind of channels back and goes to the treatment plant. However, when there's wet water, there's also this addition of a lot of water coming through the storm drain, and it can't handle that. So as designed, it's just meant to divert all of that outflow, including raw sewage, to the river. So it pollutes our water. Flooding can also disrupt the service of water to buildings. So in 2021, Hurricane Ida shut down this Belmont pumping station, which interrupted water service for about 11 days. And believe it or not, we are also at risk from sea level rise. Although, we're separated from the ocean by New Jersey, the Delaware River is not. And so as sea level rise increase, the salt line moves further and further up the Delaware River. And there's a threat that it could reach the city's drinking water intake. And so that causes a huge problem where our existing water systems won't be able to remove the salt, desalinate the water. And so we would have a serious threat to our drinking supply. Greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of Philadelphia's economy dropped 31% between 2006 and 2022, which I showed before, and that is great news. It's not enough, but the fact that we are trending downward is great news. So this, a third of the reductions happened since the city's last inventory in 2019. So something special must have happened then, and indeed it was this. The Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery caught fire and as a result was shut down. That alone was responsible for 16% of the city's total carbon footprint. So this, in combination with some more of the modest savings from energy efficient buildings and green infrastructure, we are seeing that 31% drop. And there is a commitment from Mayor Parker that we are still committed to reaching carbon neutrality by 2050. Air quality. Philadelphia was one of 17 Pennsylvania counties that received an F grade for particle pollution in the American Lung Association's latest annual State of the Air report, as I mentioned previously. This rating is based on the city experiencing more than 5 days of unhealthy levels of particle pollution on average per year from 2021 through 2030. The source of those pollutants are mostly construction sites, fires, vehicles, and power plants. And these pollutants can aggravate asthma and other lung issues, and it's even linked with heart attacks. And so you may have been in Philadelphia when this happened in 2023, when you looked outside and this is what the sky looked like. In fact, we were told to not go outside on those days. People of color were more than twice as likely as white people to live in places with failing grades, and Hispanic people were more than 3 times as likely as white people to live in a community that received all F grades. This is Russell Zerbo, a Clean Air Council advocate, who is stating that the largest contributor to poor air quality is from transportation. So to sum up, transportation, air pollution, flooding, greenhouse gas emissions, etc., basically all of these impacts are in turn impacted by how a city is designed. A city is a complex system, and designers do not and cannot, with the existing tools they have, take into account the many relationships between these drivers. And in fact, what we need is a different approach to design with new tools and frameworks. And what I want to talk about now is what are some of these new tools and frameworks that we can use. I'm going to give an example from the Sustainable Design Program and what we use and teach our students, but also make a connection to what the AIA is now proposing as a new process as well. So the processes that we use are what's called the Integral Sustainable Design Framework and Systems Thinking. The Integral Sustainable Design Framework is a method by which we look at things through 4 different lenses. And those are experience, performance, culture, and systems. When we talk about experience, we're talking about one's subjective experience, such as wellness, beauty, how you feel in a space. Do you feel too cold or too hot? Performance is about energy efficiency. Culture is about who is being served and what is an impact on a community from a design. And systems is about ecosystem services and trying to regenerate them. A way I like to talk to students about the integral sustainable design is by using this ancient parable from India. This is a parable in which blind people are asked to investigate what an elephant is. So each of them only feels a small portion of that elephant. And they walk away thinking, well, you know, the elephant, the one who's touching the ear, is really flexible and maybe even fan-like. And the one feeling the leg comes away with a very different idea about an elephant being, something very solid and like a tree trunk. None of these people would walk away with wrong ideas, just incomplete ideas. And so that is how designers are when we think about the design of the built environment. We see a portion of the whole picture. And by using a methodology like this, we can combine those different perspectives into one. And when we use them simultaneously and think across different scales, the designs will be more holistic. And so if we map the topics that I've been discussing about using the integral sustainable design framework, we can see that it covers all of these issues. It is a pretty good tool to talk about something comprehensively. So we're talking about mental health, physical health, and beauty, community health impacts, energy efficiency, greenhouse emissions, and temperature increase, land use change, and the removal of ecosystem services. And so now if we look at a very recent framework for design excellence proposed by the AIA, they have these 10 different segments. And so I wanted to see for myself, are they using a comprehensive lens when they're talking to the broader profession of architecture? And in fact, they are. These 10 different things map perfectly onto the integral sustainable design framework. So I'm excited about this AIA framework. Now, we learn different things when we look through these perspectives, but we don't understand the relationship between them. And that is where systems thinking comes in. And so we can use systems thinking. These are systems thinking diagrams, and they're tools to start to investigate and understand what's happening. And we can use it to research, for example, what is the urban heat island effect. And so quickly, when you know how to read these, you can see that there is a reinforcing loop happening and a balancing loop, and they are in competition with each other. So for example, I will turn on the air conditioner to change my indoor microclimate so that I feel comfortable. Now I have it set, to a thermostat, so whenever the temperature isn't right, it will turn on the air conditioner, and it'll keep doing this right until the 70 degrees or whatever temperature you have set is being reached. However, at the same time, that air conditioner is rejecting its waste heat and increasing the outdoor temperature, which will come back and impact my thermal comfort inside the building. So I'm cooling my building down inside, but heating up the area outside. And so we can think of a reinforcing loop as an accelerator pedal, and we can think of a balancing loop as a brake. And so if you're pushing on the brake and gas at the same time, the one that wins is the one that has kind of more pressure than the other applied to it. And so just from our own everyday observations, we know that temperatures are still increasing outside. So the reinforcing loop here must be winning. So that's a way that we can use this to understand something like the urban heat island effect. Students also use it to investigate different design solutions. And so this is an example of student investigation into sustainable healthcare for the elderly. The blue is the system as it is. The red arrows are different ideas that the students came up with. And so they proposed some very interesting things in order to combat the feeling of isolation and lack of preventative care investment, that proposing something like a daycare facility integrated with a senior housing facility may be something really valuable to each, where they could come together, for example, at story time and seniors read stories to the children, that would create a feeling of usefulness and decrease this feeling of isolation. Or another interesting proposal was an integrated student housing facility where the elderly could live with Thomas Jefferson University students, perhaps those in some health profession who could provide some of the services to those seniors. So let's look at how Philadelphia now is seeing an impact from resilient and sustainable design strategies. We'll look at how the urban heat island is being mitigated, how greenhouse gas emissions are being mitigated, how we're adapting to flooding events, mitigating poor air quality, and some other synergies, things that we are just bonuses we get for free as one solution. Because we're all a complex system, one solution can actually have impacts further upstream or downstream that we're not specifically designing for. So if we look at how to regenerate ecosystems, we can talk about the addition of trees. If we think about that systems map for a second, that would be adding another balancing loop, putting more pressure on the brake pedal to combat increasing temperatures, and that would have an impact on the outdoor air temperature. But we do have street tree programs, and this is just an example of one in Philadelphia where that is being added. We're also installing things called cool roofs. White roofs reject and reflect more heat than black ones, which absorb heat. So those can be reduce the urban heat island effect as well. We also teach students, but it's also done professionally, applying passive design techniques, which is shown here in this building cross section, and then using on-site renewable energy. And so when you can produce all of the energy on site that your building consumes, that's called a net zero building. And we design students in our program to do that. But we can see here they're talking about cross ventilation, being able to open up windows on two sides and have airflow through. We're talking about connecting them to nature. We are talking about using thermal mass in very specific ways to reduce temperatures experienced. Shading, our window placement. We take a lot of care with how much window to wall ratio there is, which is basically a measurement of how many windows do you have in your building. And there are synergies that, amplify these solutions. So synergies with regenerating the urban ecosystem. Well, green stormwater and clean water solutions also provide cooling benefits. And there's also a connection to nature which improves the physical and mental health of people in the building or living in the neighborhood. For example, this is a wonderful experience to be having as you are feeling like you're being connected to nature as you're walking through the city. How to mitigate operational and embodied carbon. We can reduce fossil fuel use to operate the buildings. again through passive design and using on-site renewable energy. This is an example of a recent project from Lauren Thompson Design, the lead architect of which was Matt Gindelsparger, who is a faculty in our program. And what a passive house project is, it's a very high performance building, very high levels of insulation in the walls, special windows that are also high performance. And so this building can run in a mixed use environment or mixed climate, as I mentioned before, very well and reduce both the heating and cooling needs during those seasons. We can also reuse existing buildings and materials. There is a saying in my profession that is the greenest building, the most sustainable building is the one that already exists. Meaning you don't need, if you can adaptively reuse a building, adapt it to its new use without having to use all of the new materials and all of their embodied carbon in a new building, then you have almost halved the emissions associated with that building. And so here is an example. Remember, this building I'm showing here is passive house, that really high performance version of a building. You can do that same thing with an existing building, as showcased here from Bright Common, which is a design firm headed by Jeremy Avellino, who is also a faculty at Thomas Jefferson University. So he was able to get extremely high performance rates out of this building. You can see here the heavy insulation that is done, and then the final image of what that building is. So if we can't reuse existing buildings and materials, then at least choose sustainable materials, ones that are rapidly renewable, that are local, and have low embodied carbon. We can also regenerate urban ecosystems, again, using trees and reducing the heat being stored in buildings. We can install cool roofs on these buildings as well. I also wanted to let you know, Philadelphia doesn't only have commitments to reduce emissions by 2050, but design professionals have also created a Philadelphia 2030 district where we have committed, it's nationwide. Cities can elect to be into this and make a commitment, and Philadelphia has. And some of the goals associated with it are to reduce energy use by 50%, again by 2030, reduce baseline water use by 50%, reduce building level transportation emissions by 50%, increase green acres through green stormwater infrastructure, increase awareness of environmental impact of the building sector, and increase education surrounding sustainable building operations. And so you can see here the progress that is being made so far. As of 2022, this was the latest report that I found available. So I just wanted to give you an idea using student work and what they're learning how to do. So this is a project in Nicetown, Tioga neighborhood. It's a healthcare net zero project. It's a cancer infusion therapy center that uses passive design, on-site renewable energy, and trees to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It also uses a biophilic approach inside the spaces, the treatment areas, to connect patients with nature while undergoing infusion therapy. And it also connects them to views to the landscape outside. And so this is what this student had proposed. Again, this is a net zero project. It is PV panels on the roof, and all of its energy consumption is being met through that. And it's also connecting people to nature, improving their physical and mental health. Adapting to flooding events. The Philadelphia Water Department created the Climate Change Adaptation Program, and as part of this initiative, the Green City Clean Waters Infrastructure Program began in 2011. And this is an example from one of their reports about what they do. So they use more efficient toilets and faucets, and then they have planters and rain barrels, etc., outside collecting the water that runs off of their roofs. Or you can also use green roofs on your roof. Permeable paving and parking lanes, larger enhanced street tree networks that filter and store runoff, and also groves and swales in parking lots. And so it's a 25-year plan to restore the local waterways through green stormwater infrastructure investments in treatment plants. And one of these, a major one that got some attention, happened in 2017 about an installation of these gardens along I-95 that can manage Olympic amounts of stormwater. This is another example of a rain garden installed in West Philadelphia across from this elementary school. This is an example of the trees being installed alongside a street, and that is taking the runoff from the street. You can see maybe here underneath. This is an inlet to this area, so the water runs in there. It gets stored there. It gets filtered and then eventually either returned to the earth or returned to the stormwater system. And this is an outreach educational experience happening here, talking to students about what green stormwater infrastructure is and what it does for us in Cliveden Park. Getting back to Eastwick, they are installing an interim flood barrier there. It looks similar to the one here photographed. That is not Eastwick, but it's something similar to that. While there's long-term planning underway. And so we actually did a student project in Eastwick. This was a hospitality project and net zero that uses the landscape as a flood prevention tool for the neighborhood. So you can see this is the project site here, and these blue areas are locations of where that water can be stored. The building location is up here. It's raised up about 12 feet above the surrounding area. And that's what a perspective of the site looks like. So here's that building I was just talking about, the hospitality building. And these areas here where you kind of see water collected are the places where stormwaters could be stored during a flooding event, during a major storm event, which would otherwise have run into the neighborhood and flooded the neighborhood. Instead, they're just kept here on this site. And the student also looked at, well, how could we use this to connect people to nature and improve their physical and mental health? Mitigating poor air quality, the City of Philadelphia's Office of Sustainability created the Climate Action Playbook that one of its focuses was improving air quality. And in 2025, they had an update. So there were things that they were doing in building an industry and also nature-based solutions. But if we look first just at the building and industry, some of what it was trying to do by 2026 is repair 500 households with low or moderate incomes to improve their energy performance, help them become and have higher indoor air quality. They're also looking to reduce carbon pollution from city-owned buildings and streetlights by 2030. Some of the nature-based solutions, that SEPTA plans to increase its green acreage by 25 acres. They're going to continue to implement that Green City Clean Waters program, which I just talked to you about a moment ago. And here is some student work. Again, this is work that was done in collaboration with the Roxborough Community Development Corporation and local residents. And so the students worked directly with the residents in order to come up with solutions that addressed their major concerns. And so what the community told us was that focus needed to be put on the tree canopy and some street safety initiatives. And at the end of the semester, the CDC was able to take and use the student work to help it apply for and win some grants in order to do this work in their neighborhood. So this is an example of some of the research that the students had done. This you can see using that integral sustainable design framework. This is the experience quadrant only that I'm showing you here, but the students cataloged, categorized, and then mapped out these different regions according to green spaces, some vacancies, where there were safety concerns, etc. And then they then went a step further and looked at optimizing the use of some of these open spaces with new designs, making them more usable and serve the community in ways that the community really wanted to see. And so we can see here some perspectives of this, the addition of rain gardens along the street and trees, open spaces and additional vegetation that give the community spaces that they can activate and use. Instead of it just being vacant and open, they can now have a use. And it also reduces the temperatures. This is one about mitigating stormwater. So this design is along Ridge Avenue. It is a little controversial because it takes a lane of traffic away, but for that lane of traffic, they get a 16 times increase in the amount of planting area, 56% more pervious surface area, more tree canopy coverage, an increase of 33%, and an increase of 300% in parking spaces, which they were able to accommodate in different locations. The Pocket Park, there were some vacant spaces that were developed into occupiable, usable outdoor spaces that the community can use to bring together for different kinds of events and to also decrease the urban heat island effect. And these types of installments also help with stormwater. And again, all of this connecting people to nature improves their physical and mental health. These are just images of students working directly with community members around the tables, designing things, talking about the solutions together. And this is all of them together at the final presentation at the end of the semester. And the community loved it. We have testimonials from them. They loved the whole process. We did it again the following year and started helping them out in more ways. So at the beginning, I said this was a major point that I wanted to make sure you understood at the end of this presentation. And that is that the environment created by a city is powerful and has a very significant impact on our individual and collective lives. And hopefully now you have at least started to understand how this is true, and that cities can actually be designed to instead support positive impacts on human health and begin to reverse many of the negative impacts which they contributed to by virtue of their design. And maybe we'll see if perhaps you've been that you can see the point that Dr. Miller is making here with this quote. I want to thank you all for the time and your attention that you gave to me while listening to this presentation. And I hope you found it useful and informative, and perhaps you will now be inspired to make some sort of collaboration with an architect or a sustainable designer. Thank you again. Take care.
And so I just want to thank Professor Fryer for the great and holistic, really touched on several different aspects of this topic in terms of sustainability, particularly focusing on climate change, health, and design of cities. And for me, there were a few takeaways that I had listening to this. And the first one is I really appreciated the fact that the environment created by the city is powerful and it has a very significant impact on our individual and collective lives. Just thinking about things that I take for granted in terms of permeable surfaces or impermeable surfaces, in terms of heights of buildings, in terms of tree canopy and tree cover, all of these things and how those might have an impact even on vector-borne diseases. So this is an environment that definitely has an impact on our lives. The second thing that I found to be really powerful and impactful in this webinar is the fact that cities contribute to climate change in various ways, right? It could be the greenhouse gas emissions that we actually are emitting, be it embodied carbon or be it from the energy while we are trying to achieve thermal comfort, you know. So all of these different ways that cities contribute to climate change are important for us to recognize that even in the construction of cities, as we leads to land use changes, that is also contributing because we will have less trees that can sequester carbon. The other thing was that the city design can influence how the impacts of climate change are experienced. You know, I was just thinking about how, you know, when they're flooding, being able to, for that water to drain, to be reticulated into the ground is very much dependent on how cities are designed. You know, for if we want to improve things like active transport and walking, thinking about do we have walking lanes or do we have bike lanes to improve that active transport? So all of these really help me appreciate the fact that city design does have an impact on this, how climate change is going to be experienced. And so are there enough places that people can sit and take a break when it is extremely hot if they decided to engage in active transport? So all these first 3 points together lead me to come to this next key takeaway, which is that if cities contribute to climate change, if cities can impact how climate change is experienced, you know, if cities generally have an impact on health and well-being, then it means that the designers of cities, right, and these are I've picked to their architects and urban planners have got a role to play, but it can be extensive. It can be more extensive that we can think about HVAC engineers as well. We can think about industries that are supplying power. So all of these individuals or these disciplines have a role in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And I think sometimes these are not intuitively the first professions or occupations that we think about. But after listening to this webinar, I hope that's a key takeaway from you. I was really interested in learning about the integral sustainable design framework together with system thinking and how these are powerful tools to use as we think about reshaping city designs. From the integral sustainability design framework, I really appreciated the fact that both experience and culture are incorporated into that framework. And what I found even more interesting as a public health practitioner is that the integral sustainability design framework does not work, right, unless you include the different experiences of different individuals. And so that means collaboration. That means inviting different voices to the table so that you can understand what those experiences are, so that you can understand what the cultural constructs you have to be aware of as you're making this design. And then systems thinking for me, as an epidemiologist, almost led me to think about directed acyclic graphs where you're showing how one variable is connected to the other one or how one variable might, be causally associated with another variable. It made me think about things like what are moderators and mediators. But in this particular sense, those system thinkings, it was great to see how you can see the negative and the positive feedback loop and how one action might actually exacerbate climate change impacts more than what the individual who's doing that action would actually think about. And so I think in finality, I just want to say that through collaboration, what I learned from this webinar is that through collaboration, cities can be designed to support positive impacts on human health. So I hope you enjoyed this webinar as much as I did. Thank you so much for your participation with this webinar.
I would like to acknowledge Adrienne Wood, who edited and produced the webinars, and all of the webinar organizers shown on this slide, who curated webinars on a variety of climate change and health topics. We invite you to follow this QR code to the College of Physicians YouTube page, where you can access the webinar series. The QR code on the bottom right will take you to the section on public health and preventive medicine, We hope you will consider joining this section to learn more about public health and activities to improve it in the Philadelphia region. Thank you for your interest in our webinar series on climate change and health in Philadelphia.